The Civil War. When America fought itself. America once came closer to tearing itself apart than at any other moment in history. Brothers fought brothers, entire states broke away, and the nation's very survival hung in the balance. It wasn't a war against a foreign power. It was America fighting itself. At the heart of it all was one question. Could a nation founded on liberty endure while millions were denied freedom? This is the story of the Civil War, the bloodiest, most defining conflict in American history. Shadows over the Republic, 1820-1836. The fragile Union after the Revolution, the year is 1820. Barely 4 decades have passed since the American colonies threw off the chains of empire. The republic they built, conceived in liberty, dedicated to equality, is already showing cracks. From the rocky hills of New England to the cotton fields of Georgia, 2 visions of America are taking shape. One looks to the future, of industry, free labor, and expansion of democracy. The other looks to the past, to tradition, hierarchy, and the labor of enslaved millions. The founders had hoped the question of slavery might fade away on its own. But it did not. Instead, it grew. The invention of the cotton gin, the expansion of southern plantations, and the hunger of British textile mills made enslaved labor more profitable than ever before. What had once been described as a necessary evil was now defended by Southern elites as a positive good. America had defeated monarchy, but it had not defeated bondage. Visuals, sweeping shots of early America, rivers winding through cotton fields, smokestacks in northern towns, maps showing new western territories opening to settlement. This was the paradox of the new republic, founded on liberty, dependent on slavery. And in the 1820s, that paradox began to pull the nation apart. The invention of the Cotton Kingdom in 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, changed everything. What had been slow, tedious labor, removing seeds from short staple cotton, became a booming business. By 1820, the Deep South, from Georgia through Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, became the engine of the global cotton trade. Britain's Industrial Revolution ran on American cotton. So did the North's textile mills. Riverboats loaded with cotton bales glide down the Mississippi. Enslaved men and women toil under the blazing sun. Overseers on horseback shout orders. Cotton was king, and the slaves who picked it were its crown jewels. By the 1820 census, nearly 1.5 million African Americans lived enslaved in the South, 1 out of every 5 people in the nation. Each new Western territory became a new question. Would slavery go there too? For Southerners, the expansion of slavery was essential to their economy and way of life. For Northerners, its spread was a moral and political threat. The balance of free and slave states in Congress became a matter of survival for both sides. The Missouri Compromise, 1820. A line drawn across the nation in 1819. Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state. The debate that followed shook Congress to its core. For the first time, Northern representatives openly opposed the extension of slavery on moral grounds. Southern leaders warned that any attempt to restrict slavery would break the Union apart. Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser, stepped forward with a delicate solution. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine, carved from Massachusetts, would enter as free. And a line would be drawn across the map, latitude 36 to 30E, dividing the Louisiana Territory. North of that line, slavery was banned. South of it, permitted visuals, parchment maps marked with a glowing red line across the continent. The Missouri Compromise was hailed as a triumph of moderation, a way to save the Union. But beneath the surface, it revealed a terrible truth, that the Republic's survival now depended on dividing its ideals, its land and its people along an artificial line. Thomas Jefferson, old and weary at Monticello, wrote to a friend, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. He was right to be afraid. Sectional tensions in the 1820s, 1830s, after 1820, the nation's politics began to bend around that invisible line. In the North, cities like Lowell and Providence bustled with new factories. Immigrant labor poured in. Canals and railroads tied the region to markets and machines. In the South, fortunes rose on cotton and human bondage. Wealth was measured not in factories or steam engines, but in acres and slaves. Two civilizations, one industrial, one agrarian, were growing side by side, but in opposite directions. A montage, northern mills clattering with noise, southern plantations glowing in sunset light. Each accused the other of corruption. Southerners mocked the North as a land of wage slaves and greedy merchants. Northerners condemned the South as a feudal world of cruelty and stagnation. The press fed the fire. Political pamphlets, sermons, and speeches sharpened every disagreement. Tariffs, banking, internal improvements, intersectional grievance. In 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of Abominations, raising duties on imported goods to protect Northern industry. The South was furious. Planters who relied on British trade saw it as an attack on their livelihoods. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, once a nationalist, now a champion of the South, wrote that states had the right to nullify any federal law they deemed unconstitutional. The seeds of rebellion were being planted. The rise of abolitionism in the North. While Southern politicians defended slavery as essential, a new movement was rising in the North. Abolitionism. At first, it was small. Ministers, Quakers, free blacks, and reformers who saw slavery as a sin that stained the soul of the nation. But by the 1830s, it was growing louder. William Lloyd Garrison, the fiery editor of The Liberator, wrote, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Presses rolling, newspapers spreading across northern towns. Public halls filled with fiery orators and citizens debating the future of freedom. Abolitionists used the new power of print to awaken conscience. They sent pamphlets south by the thousands. They organized petitions to Congress. At the same time, formerly enslaved voices, like Frederick Douglass, began to tell the nation what bondage truly meant. Their words shattered the myth of the happy slave and exposed the violence at slavery's heart. But their moral clarity also provoked a fierce backlash. In the South, abolitionist literature was banned. Northern mobs attacked anti-slavery speakers, fearing that agitation would destroy the Union or their trade with the South. Freedom and Union, once united ideals, were now pulling in opposite directions. The nullification crisis, Calhoun, Jackson, and the meaning of the Union, 1832. The conflict between state and nation reached the boiling point. South Carolina declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within its borders. The state threatened secession if Washington tried to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson, himself a Southerner and slaveholder, would have none of it. Jackson's words thundered, "Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?" He mobilized troops and issued a proclamation asserting the supremacy of the Union. Calhoun resigned as vice president and joined the Senate to defend his state's cause. Tense meetings in Charleston. Soldiers drilling, Jackson at his desk writing proclamations. Congress, led again by Henry Clay, forged a compromise, a gradual reduction of tariffs that allowed both sides to claim victory. The crisis passed, but the wounds remained. For the first time, a Southern state had openly defied the federal government. And for the first time, the president had threatened military force to preserve the Union. The question lingered. If a state could nullify one law, could it not one day nullify the entire Union? Early debates over slavery in Congress by the mid-1830s, the battle over slavery had moved from the plantations and newspapers to the very halls of Congress. Abolitionists flooded Washington with petitions demanding the end of slavery in the District of Columbia. Southern representatives responded with fury. In 1836, they pushed through the gag rule, automatically tabling any petition on slavery without discussion. It was a silencing of democracy, proof that even talking about freedom was dangerous. John Quincy Adams, the former president now serving in the House, became the conscience of the chamber. He fought for years to repeal the gag rule. Insisting that the right to petition was sacred, Adams declared, "The freedom of debate is essential to the freedom of the people, but for the South, silence was security." Slaveholders saw abolitionist debate as an existential threat. They demanded loyalty, unity, and suppression of dissent at any cost. In the North, many citizens who once prized union above all began to wonder what kind of union it had become, one that demanded they keep silent about human bondage. Candlelit congressional chambers, angry debates, Adams standing alone against a sea of hostile faces. A nation divided in spirit by 1836, America was a nation of contradictions. It was growing richer, larger, and more powerful than ever. Yet beneath the progress lay an unhealed wound. Every invention, every new state, every law brought the same old question back to life. Could a republic founded on freedom survive half slave and half free? The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line on the map, but the real line ran through the heart of the nation itself, the map of America slowly darkening along sectional lines. The faint toll of a church bell, the shadows were lengthening over the republic. And in those shadows, the seeds of conflict had already begun to grow. The politics of division, 1837, 1850. Storm clouds after prosperity, the year 1837. The nation that had seemed so full of promise now faced uncertainty. The cotton fields still bloomed white across the South, and northern factories still roared with progress. But beneath the hum of prosperity, fear and suspicion spread. America was growing, but not together. Each new mile of railroad, each new acre of land, widened the gulf between two ways of life. And when the economy suddenly collapsed, that gulf would become an open wound. The Panic of 1837. Economy in free-fall crowded New York banks shuttering their doors. Lines of anxious depositors, Southern merchants staring at unpaid invoices. Speculation, easy credit, and reckless land buying had fueled a bubble. When it burst, the nation plunged into its first Great Depression. Factories closed. Prices fell. Thousands lost jobs and farms. The blame game began. Northerners accused President Andrew, Jackson's banking policies, his war on the Second, Bank of the United States, for destroying stability. Southerners muttered that Northern financiers had drained Southern wealth and left planters with worthless paper money. Economic pain deepened regional resentment. The North demanded protective tariffs to shelter its industries. The South demanded free trade to sell cotton abroad, and both began to suspect that the other section profited from their suffering. Economic pain deepened regional resentment. The North demanded protective tariffs to shelter its industries. The South demanded free trade to sell cotton abroad, and both began to suspect that the other section profited from their suffering. Out of the wreckage rose a new political order, the Whigs and the Democrats, parties that claimed to represent the whole nation, but in truth mirrored its divisions. Manifest destiny, a nation's dream and dilemma even in depression, Americans looked west. Beyond the Mississippi lay a promise, new land, new fortune, new beginnings. Newspapers spoke of manifest destiny, the belief that Providence had chosen the United States to spread liberty from ocean to ocean. But liberty for whom? Pioneers trudging through prairie grass, wagon wheels cutting ruts toward an endless horizon. As settlers crossed into Texas, Oregon, and the Mexican frontier, they carried more than plows and rifles. They carried the question of slavery. Would these new lands be free or slave? Every new territory reopened the battle the Missouri line had only delayed. The Texas question in the 1820s, Mexico invited American settlers to populate its northern province, Texas. Within a decade, the newcomers, mostly slaveholding Southerners, outnumbered Mexican citizens. When Mexico abolished slavery, Texas rebelled, recreations of the Alamo, Santa Anna's troops, the Lone Star flag rising. In 1836, after a brutal struggle, Texas declared independence. To Southerners, annexing Texas promised vast new cotton lands and new slave states. To Northerners, it threatened to tilt the Union permanently toward the slave power. For nearly a decade, Texas remained an independent republic, a pawn on the chessboard of sectional politics. Presidents hesitated. The Union was too fragile to risk another quarrel over slavery. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, triumph and trouble. When James K. Polk became president in 1845, he vowed to fulfill manifest destiny. He annexed Texas. Mexico protested. Troops clashed along the Rio Grande. Congress declared war. Soldiers marching through deserts. Cannons firing outside Veracruz. The American flag raised above Chapultepec Castle. The war was short, victorious and controversial. To its supporters, it was the nation's glorious expansion. To its critics, it was a war of conquest for the slave interest. A young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, demanded to know the exact spot where blood had been shed, a protest that earned him scorn. An aging philosopher, Henry David Thoreau, refused to pay taxes and went to jail, declaring the war unjust. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, the United States gained more than half of Mexico's land: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah. It was a victory that doubled the nation's size and halved its peace. For every new acre raised the old question anew: would slavery cross the deserts and mountains of the West? The Wilmot Proviso: no slavery in the West. In 1846, as war still raged, Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a simple amendment. Any territory taken from Mexico would be closed to slavery. It passed the House, failed in the Senate, and ignited a storm. Southerners saw it as an insult, proof that the North meant to strangle their institution. Northerners saw it as justice, proof that the nation should not expand bondage into lands won in the name of freedom. Crowded House chamber, delegates shouting across aisles. The Wilmot Proviso never became law, but its echo split every major party along sectional lines. There could no longer be a truly national politics. The Wilmot Proviso never became law, but its echo split every major party along sectional lines. There could no longer be a truly national politics. Southern alarm bells by the late 1840s. Southern leaders began to speak openly of secession. They called it Southern rights. John C. Calhoun, now white-haired and frail, warned the Senate that the South would not remain in a union that treated slavery as sin. He argued that the Constitution itself guaranteed slave property equal protection. Calhoun's final words: "The cords which bind these states together are snapping one by one." As he left the chamber for the last time, a hush fell. Calhoun died soon after, but his prophecy lingered. The gold rush and the crisis of 1850 in 1848. Gold was discovered in California. Within months, tens of thousands poured across the continent, ships crowding San Francisco Bay, miners knee-deep in muddy rivers, tents flying the stars and stripes. California's population exploded, and with it came the same old question: would it enter the Union free or slave? Southerners demanded balance. Northerners argued that California's settlers had already banned slavery in their constitution. The Senate teetered: 15 free states, 15 slave states. California would tip the scale. The Compromise of 1850, Clay's last gamble once again. The aged Henry Clay returned to the stage, determined to save the Union he had twice before rescued. Senate chamber. Clay's trembling hands clutching papers, his proposal sought to calm both sections. Admit California as a free state. Allow New Mexico and Utah to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. Abolish the slave trade, but not slavery, in Washington. D.C., and to appease the South, create a harsher fugitive slave law forcing citizens to return escaped slaves. Admit California as a free state. Allow New Mexico and Utah to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. Abolish the slave trade, but not slavery, in Washington, D.C., and to appease the South, create a harsher fugitive slave law forcing citizens to return escaped slaves. Debate raged for months. Clay pleaded for harmony. Calhoun's followers warned of doom. Then a new voice rose. The young Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, who broke the package into parts and guided them through Congress. President Millard Fillmore signed them into law. The Union had been saved, again, but at what cost? The Fugitive Slave Act. Fear comes north. The new law gave slave catchers power to hunt fugitives in every state. Accused runaways were denied jury trials. Ordinary citizens could be fined or jailed for refusing to help. Night streets of Boston. Federal marshals dragging a trembling man in chains. Crowds shouting, "Shame!" For the first time, slavery reached into the free North. Families were torn apart. Churches rang their bells in protest. Men who had never seen the South suddenly felt its iron grip. The Underground Railroad expanded in defiance. A young woman named Harriet Tubman, once enslaved herself, began leading others to freedom through darkness and danger. The law intended to quiet the South instead inflamed the North. And in the South, every act of Northern resistance confirmed a belief that the North no longer respected Southern rights. A nation in political breakdown. By 1850, America stood divided in every sense, politically, economically, morally. The old parties crumbled under sectional strain. Whigs in the South defended slavery. Whigs in the North denounced it. Democrats fractured between moderates and fire-eaters. The old parties crumbled under sectional strain. Whigs in the South defended slavery. Whigs in the North denounced it. Democrats fractured between moderates and fire-eaters. The old parties crumbled under sectional strain. The great illusion of peace. Sunset over the Capitol dome, telegraph wires stretching westward, steamboats gliding along the Mississippi. The Union had survived another crisis, but only by silencing its conscience. Freedom and slavery now shared the same flag, the same anthem, the same fragile peace. For a brief moment, Americans convinced themselves that compromise had triumphed, that the Republic could endure half slave and half free. But beneath that illusion, something restless stirred, a growing conviction that the issue could not be bargained away forever. The decade ahead would prove it. Soon the land would bleed again. Blood in the Heartland, 1850-1856. The peace. That wasn't the compromise of 1850 had promised calm. But peace in America now meant silence. The silence of fear. The silence of denial. Beneath that uneasy quiet, the ground trembled. The fugitive slave law had made slavery a national institution. Freedom had no boundaries, neither did bondage. In Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, cities once symbols of liberty, federal marshals now marched men and women in chains through northern streets, night streets lit by lanterns. Rain-soaked cobblestones, abolitionists huddled in protest. Each capture, each courtroom struggle ripped away another layer of illusion. The line between North and South was no longer drawn. On a map, it ran through every American heart, the Underground Railroad and the moral. War out of defiance came courage. Along hidden trails, through forests and river crossings, a secret network of ordinary people built a lifeline for freedom. The Underground Railroad. They were farmers, ministers, teachers, and freedmen who risked their lives to lead fugitives north. Among them was Harriet Tubman, born enslaved in Maryland, escaped to freedom, then returned again and again to rescue others. To her people, she was Moses, Tubman guiding fugitives through the swamp. Whispering prayers beneath starlight, she carried a revolver for protection and a Bible for strength. By the 1850s, She had guided more than 70 souls to freedom. For every life she saved, the South demanded vengeance. Posters offered bounties for her capture. Slaveholders spoke of conspiracies, insurrections, and treason. Freedom itself had become rebellion. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, a minister's daughter in Maine picked up her pen and changed the world. Harriet Beecher Stowe had never set foot on a plantation, but she had seen the pain of families torn apart by the fugitive slave law. She poured her outrage into a story, Uncle Tom's Cabin, pages turning, printing presses clattering, books stacked high in shop windows. It told of a gentle, faithful slave, Tom, and the cruelty that consumed him. It was not history. It was emotion, and it struck the nation like lightning. 300,000 copies sold in a single year. Readers wept, raged, and argued. Southerners denounced it as slander. Northerners called it revelation. Abraham Lincoln would later greet Stowe as the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. For the first time, millions saw slavery not as distant politics, but as moral catastrophe. The war for America's conscience had begun, in the human heart. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Pandora's box, opens while Stowe's words awakened sympathy. Washington awakened chaos. In 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois sought to build a transcontinental railroad linking Chicago to the Pacific. To organize the western lands, he proposed a new law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It would repeal the Missouri Compromise line of 1820. Instead, settlers themselves would decide whether to permit slavery, a principle Douglas called popular sovereignty. Animated map, Missouri line erased, territories labeled Kansas and Nebraska. The act passed Congress and shattered the nation's political order. The South rejoiced. It opened new land to slavery. The North felt betrayed. An old promise had been broken. As Douglas celebrated self-government, the prairies erupted into war. Bleeding Kansas, the mini-Civil War in 1854 and 1855. Settlers poured into Kansas, some seeking land, others seeking to control its soul. Pro-slavery, border ruffians from Missouri crossed over to cast illegal votes and terrorize free soil settlers. Abolitionist pioneers founded towns like Lawrence and Topeka, determined to keep Kansas free. Wagons rolling across dusty plains, armed men marching under rival flags. Two governments formed, one slave, one free. Two constitutions, two capitals, one territory. What began as ballots soon became bullets. In May 1856, pro-slavery mobs sacked the town of Lawrence, burning homes, smashing printing presses, and driving abolitionists into the prairie. Days later, a stern-eyed abolitionist named John Brown took revenge. With his sons and followers, he attacked a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek. 5 men were dragged from their cabins and hacked to death. In the tall grass of Kansas, Americans learned that political compromise could spill real blood, flames licking across cabins, shadows of men with rifles against the night. The territory became a battlefield. Neighbors turned enemies, each convinced they fought for liberty. Kansas earned a new name, Bleeding Kansas, violence in the Senate, the caning of Charles Sumner. The violence of Kansas soon reached the heart of government itself. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." For 2 days, he denounced the slave power, accusing Southern leaders of tyranny and brutality. He singled out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina by name. 2 days later, Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber. Finding Sumner at his desk, Brooks raised a heavy cane and beat him unconscious. Echoing blows in the Senate, papers flying, horrified senators rushing forward. Sumner collapsed in blood. It took him years to recover. In the South, Brooks was celebrated as a hero. Canes engraved with "Hit him again" were sent as gifts. In the North, church bells tolled in outrage. The assault symbolized what words could no longer hide, that the nation's divisions had become physical, personal, and unrestrained. Birth of the Republican Party, a new political firestorm in the ashes of the old parties. A new force rose. The Whig Party collapsed under the weight of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Its fragments, anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, and disillusioned Democrats, gathered in protest. In a small meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, in 1854, they chose a name that echoed the Revolution, Republican. The new party declared that slavery must not expand into the territories. It did not yet demand abolition in the South, only containment. But containment was enough to terrify the South rallies in northern towns, banners reading, "Free soil, free labor, free men." To the planters, the Republicans threatened their future. To many in the North, they represented hope, the belief that democracy and slavery could not coexist forever. In 1856, the young party nominated John C. Fremont, a Western explorer, as its first presidential candidate. His slogan, "Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont." He lost, but the Republicans had carried 11 free states. A new political map was forming, one that mirrored the fault line of the coming war. The 1856 election and the Southern reaction. The election of 1856 was unlike any before it. Campaign speeches spoke not of taxes or tariffs, but of loyalty and survival. The Democrats rallied behind James Buchanan, a Pennsylvanian with Southern sympathies, who promised to end the turmoil by enforcing the Compromise of 1850. The South warned that Fremont's victory would mean secession. Buchanan won. The Union endured, for now. But the vote revealed a terrifying truth. The nation had divided into two hostile political worlds, Republican North, Democratic South, with almost no middle ground, divided map glowing red and blue. Newspapers screaming, "Victory for Buchanan," and Republicans rising. The bleeding heartland as prophecy between 1850 and 1856, the promise of compromise had died. The West, once the symbol of opportunity, had become the proving ground of America's soul. Kansas bled. The Senate bled. And the idea of a peaceful union bled with them. The decade was only half done. But the Republic had already rehearsed its future, a war fought not over land, but over the definition of freedom itself. The people who fired in anger on the plains of Kansas would soon meet again, at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at Shiloh, under national flags that no longer meant the same thing. The gathering storm lightning over prairie grass, fading photographs of John Brown, Sumner's blood-stained desk, and the American flag half-shadowed in darkness. America's experiment in liberty was trembling on the edge. The old compromises had failed, and new ones only deepened the wound. The Union's heartland had become a battlefield of conscience, a warning of what was to come. And soon, one man's violent dream of justice would ignite the final spark. John Brown was not finished. The next blow would fall not in Kansas, but in Virginia. The breaking point, 1857-1859. By 1857, the United States stood at a crossroads of destiny. The spirit of compromise that had once held North and South together was gone. The courts, the Congress, and the pulpit now spoke not with the language of unity, but of final judgment. The question of slavery was no longer political. It had become moral, divine, and apocalyptic. The Dred Scott decision. Citizenship denied in March 1857. The Supreme Court of the United States handed down one of the most infamous rulings in its history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. In March 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down one of the most infamous rulings in its history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, a slave from Missouri, had lived for years in free territory with his owner. He sued for his freedom, arguing that residence on free soil made him a free man. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, A Marylander and former slaveholder delivered the court's majority opinion, a sweeping blow to black freedom and to the fragile balance of the Union. Taney wrote, "The Negro has no rights which the white man is bound to. Respect. The court declared that African Americans, enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. It also struck down the Missouri Compromise, declaring Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The ruling shattered decades of political compromise. What Congress had tried to contain, the Supreme Court had now unleashed." Historian voiceover, dramatic reenactment. The court's decision made slavery national and freedom sectional. It told every free state that its laws could not protect black men on their soil. In the North, outrage boiled over. The Chicago Tribune called it a monstrous crime against liberty. But in the South, the decision was celebrated as validation, a judicial guarantee that slavery was safe from federal interference. It was as if the last barrier between reason and revolution had fallen. Lincoln versus Douglas. A nation debates. Its soul in the summer of 1858. The people of Illinois gathered in town squares, dusty fields, and courthouse lawns to witness one of the great battles of words in American history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas, the Democratic senator and champion of popular sovereignty, argued that the people of each territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown former congressman, insisted that the nation could not survive half free and half slave. Lincoln, reenactment. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. Douglas accused Lincoln of seeking racial equality and revolution. Lincoln replied that slavery was a moral wrong that must be placed in the course of ultimate extinction. Across Illinois, crowds swelled into the thousands. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans reprinted every word. Though Douglas narrowly won re-election, Lincoln emerged as the new voice of the Northern conscience, calm, logical, and resolute. Historian voiceover. Lincoln's moral clarity frightened the South. They heard not a politician but a preacher, and they knew, if he ever reached the presidency, their world was doomed. The Panic of 1857, economic tremors and sectional blame. That same year, another crisis swept through the land, not moral but financial. The Panic of 1857, triggered by overspeculation, falling grain prices, and the collapse of a major New York bank, plunged the North into recession. Factories closed. Unemployment rose. But in the South, where cotton prices remained strong, many saw it as proof of their economic superiority. Southern editorial, reenacted. Behold the folly of Northern industry. The South, built on King Cotton, stands secure and self-sufficient. To Southern planters, the panic confirmed that their slave-based economy was not only stable, but divinely favored. To Northern workers, it exposed the fragility of a system increasingly manipulated by wealthy elites and Southern power. The divide between free labor and slave labor now carried not only moral weight, but economic fire. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the meteor of the war. On an October night in 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist from Kansas, led 21 men on a desperate mission. Their target, the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia Brown's goal was to seize weapons, arm enslaved people, and ignite a general uprising across the South. It was madness and martyrdom. Brown's small force included 5 free black men and several of his own sons. They captured the arsenal, but local militia and U.S. Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, quickly surrounded them. After a fierce gunfight, Brown was captured. 10 of his men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Witness account, soft, grave voice. He looked calm, like a man who had seen a vision and was ready to die for it. At his trial, Brown refused to plead insanity. He declared his act righteous in the eyes of God. John Brown, reenactment. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, is no wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, I say so let it be done. He was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. The North wept. Church bells tolled in his honor. The South armed itself, convinced the next raid would come not from 20 men, but from the entire North. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "John Brown will make the gallows glorious like the cross." Historian voiceover. Brown's death made compromise impossible. To Southerners, he was a terrorist. To Northerners, a saint. The gulf between these visions of righteousness was unbridgeable. The South mobilizes, the North awakens in the wake of Harper's Ferry. Southern states organized militias, revived old arsenals, and began secret preparations for defense. Newspapers called for vigilance against Northern invaders. Charleston Mercury, "We must prepare for war is upon us." In the North, the reaction was equally intense. The Republican Party, still only 5 years old, grew rapidly, fueled by outrage at Southern paranoia and the Dred Scott ruling. Moderates who once urged patience now spoke of moral duty. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass declared that slavery must die or the Republic must perish. The political map of America had turned red and blue, long before those colors would define the future. The culture of fear and prophecy across the nation. Pulpits became battlefields. In Northern churches, preachers thundered that slavery was a sin that invited divine punishment. In the South, ministers quoted scripture to justify bondage as the will of God. Literature and art reflected the coming storm. In the North, poems like Whittier's Ichabod lamented the nation's moral decay. In the South, defenders like George Fitzhugh published Cannibals All, arguing that enslaved labor was more humane than Northern wage slavery. Even families divided. Letters between brothers and cousins, once warm with affection, turned cold and bitter with politics and fear. Historian voiceover. By 1859, Americans no longer saw the same country. They spoke the same language, but their meanings had changed. To the South, liberty meant the right to own slaves. To the North, liberty meant freedom for all. Prelude to the fall as 1859 ended, the Union stood on a knife's edge. No great battle had yet been fought, no secession declared, but the psychological break was complete. The nation that once saw compromise as its greatest virtue now saw it as betrayal. Each side believed God was on its side. Each side believed the other had become an enemy of freedom. The stage was set. The next election would decide not just a president, but the fate of the American Union itself. In just 3 years, the courtroom, the pulpit, and the battlefield would merge. From Dred Scott to John Brown, from Illinois to Virginia, the moral war had already begun. The time for talking was nearly over. The time for fighting had come. Continue with Part 5. The Union falls apart, 1860-1861. In the winter of 1860, America stood on the brink. For 40 years, compromise had delayed a reckoning between freedom and slavery, but it could delay no longer. The election of a tall, quiet man from Illinois would ignite the fire that consumed a nation. The election of 1860, a nation divided at the ballot box. The campaign of 1860 was unlike any in American history. 4 major candidates stood for the presidency, each representing a different vision of what the Union meant. Abraham Lincoln, of the Republican Party, opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Stephen A. Douglas of the Northern Democrats called for popular sovereignty. John C. Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats defended the rights of slaveholders everywhere. John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party pleaded for moderation and peace. But moderation was dead. The American electorate had split along lines of fear and identity, not just policy. Newspapers in the South warned that Lincoln's victory would mean the end of the Southern way of life. In the North, abolitionists prayed that God would finally strike down slavery. Historian voiceover, Lincoln never promised to abolish slavery where it existed, only to stop its spread. But to Southern ears, that was enough to signal the beginning of their destruction. When the votes were counted, the result was decisive, but regionally absolute. Lincoln carried every northern free state, yet not a single southern one. Breckinridge swept the Deep South. Douglas took only Missouri. The Union itself had voted as two nations. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States by the North, and the North alone. The shockwave of secession. A fire-eater's dream. In Charleston, South Carolina, celebrations erupted, not for Lincoln, but for departure. Southern radicals, known as fire-eaters, had long promised that if a Republican ever won the presidency, the South would leave the Union. Now, their moment had come. Charleston Mercury headline, reenactment, the Union is dissolved. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted unanimously to secede from the United States. Crowds filled the streets, cannon fire echoed across the harbor, and the state flag replaced the stars and stripes. In a single act, South Carolina reopened the question settled by the Revolution. Was the United States a permanent union, or merely a voluntary compact of sovereign states? Within weeks, the secession fever spread. Mississippi followed on January 9, 1861. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon after. By February, 7 states had left the Union entirely. The birth of the Confederacy in February 1861. Delegates from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution almost identical to the U.S. Constitution. Except for one thing, it explicitly protected slavery forever. Historian voiceover. They took the framework of American liberty and rewrote it to defend human bondage. It was both an imitation and a rejection of the United States. On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was inaugurated as President of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis reenactment. Our present condition, achieved in less than 2 months, presents a spectacle such as the world has rarely seen. We have entered upon a new career, a new government, founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. The South called it independence. The North saw it as rebellion. Lincoln's long wait, the silent president-elect. While the South seceded, Abraham Lincoln had not yet taken office. Between November 1860 and March 1861, the nation drifted leaderless. President James Buchanan, paralyzed by indecision, declared secession illegal, but also claimed he had no power to stop it. It was as if the country had slipped into a political coma. Federal arsenals, forts, and custom houses in the South fell one by one to state militias, while Washington hesitated. In Springfield, Lincoln prepared for his journey to the capital, reading letters from panicked Northerners and hopeful abolitionists. He knew that one false word could trigger war before he even took the oath. Lincoln, reenactment. If the Union is to be dissolved, it will be at the election of others, not mine. I will hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government. The last chance for peace. Crittenden's Compromise. In the final weeks before Lincoln's inauguration, one last desperate attempt at compromise emerged. The Crittenden Compromise. Proposed by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, it sought to restore the old Missouri Compromise line, allowing slavery south of 36°30' all the way to the Pacific. But Lincoln refused to support it. Extending slavery's reach, he believed, would betray everything the Republican Party stood for. And so the last bridge between North and South collapsed, not with gunfire, but with silence. Historian voiceover. By early 1861, the time for compromise had passed. The two sides no longer disagreed about policy. They disagreed about the moral nature of man. Lincoln takes the oath. We are not enemies, but friends, March 4, 1861. A cold wind blew through Washington as Abraham Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible and swore the presidential oath. In his inaugural address, he spoke to a divided nation with words of restraint and faith. Lincoln, reenactment. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. He vowed not to invade the South, unless forced to defend the Union's property and authority. To some, his words were a plea for peace. To others, a promise of war. To some, his words were a plea for peace. To others, a promise of war. In the crowd, spies from the Confederacy listened closely. They heard not compromise, but defiance. Fort Sumter. The first shots, at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, stood Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold manned by a small U.S. garrison under Major Robert Anderson. By April 1861, the fort was surrounded by Confederate guns. Supplies were running low. Lincoln faced a terrible choice: abandon it or resupply it and risk war. He chose to send food, not weapons, to the hungry soldiers, but to the Confederates. Any resupply meant invasion. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard gave the order. A single mortar shell arced across the dark sky and exploded above the fort. The Civil War had begun. For 34 hours, Confederate batteries rained fire upon Fort Sumter. The Union garrison returned fire, but their guns were few. At last, Anderson surrendered. No one was killed in the bombardment, but the psychological impact was devastating. Historian voiceover: Fort Sumter turned secession into rebellion, and rebellion into war. The call to arms. Brothers once, soldiers now. When news reached Washington, Lincoln acted at once. On April 15, 1861, he called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was electric. Crowds in northern cities cheered, waved flags, and sang "The Star-Spangled Banner." Young men rushed to enlist, believing the war would be over in weeks. But in the South, the call for troops meant invasion. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, states that had hesitated, now joined the Confederacy. In the space of a month, America transformed from one nation to two armies. Families split apart. Brother fought brother, and the land that had once been a beacon of liberty became a battlefield for its very meaning. The end of compromise. From the Missouri Compromise to Fort Sumter, 41 years had passed. 4 decades of fragile peace, political patchwork, and moral avoidance. In that time, the United States had grown vast and powerful, yet spiritually divided. The founders had left the question of slavery unresolved, believing time or reason would settle it. But time had failed. Reason had fallen silent. Historian voiceover. The Civil War did not begin at Fort Sumter. It began in every argument postponed, every compromise signed in fear, and every human life bought and sold for profit. The storm has broken. In the spring of 1861, the Union cracked, and the world held its breath. From the rivers of Virginia to the plains of Kansas, men took up arms, each believing they fought for liberty. One side for the freedom of man, the other for the freedom to enslave. The seeds of conflict had finally borne their terrible fruit, and from their roots would grow a war that would remake the nation, in blood, in fire, and at last, in freedom. America divided, the eve of Civil War. Final epic shot, split map of America glowing red and blue, lightning crack running down the middle, soldiers marching on both sides. From the cotton fields of the South to the factories of the North, from the halls of Congress to the streets of Kansas, Americans had fought, in law, in debate, and in violence, over the very soul of their nation. By 1861, compromise was gone. The moral, political, and economic tensions had reached a breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln, the secession of Southern states, and the first shots at Fort Sumter marked the end of one era and the terrifying beginning of another. The story of the Civil War did not begin with cannon fire. It began in the hearts, the laws, and the choices of men and women who could not reconcile freedom with slavery. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and from them would grow a war that would reshape America, in blood, in courage, and in the struggle for liberty, the Civil War, 1861-1865. The struggle for the soul of America had begun. Subscribe to explore more untold stories of history, and join us as we uncover the moments that shape the world.